From the NewsChannel 5 network, this is Open Line.
Welcome into Open Line, everybody. Rhori Johnston in the chair here tonight. We do appreciate you tuning in on this Thursday night. We have a doozy for you tonight. As you see below the phone number here, our topic tonight is the presence of white nationalists in politics. And after last week's raid, riot, insurrection, whatever you call it, at the Capitol, there is a lot of concern that we have reported on NewsChannel 5 and CBS News and other outlets have reported. Homeland Security has a lot of concerns heading into Inauguration Day. So we're backing up and just taking a look at the history and just kind of generically that topic, white nationalism in politics. We have a great guest who's going to help us along here to understand this tonight. Sophie Bork James, an assistant professor of anthropology at Vanderbilt University, and she has authored a number of writings, including op-eds and articles on this topic. Sophie, thanks so much for being with us tonight. We do appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
I heard you right beforehand, just like typical Zoom, talking to the family, saying, hey, I'm about to go on. Let's focus now. When I saw this topic that our producer Taylor gave me, at first I kind of shook my head and said, I don't know much about this. I'm going to have to dig in and as I did some reading, it really is fascinating. So let's start from the beginning. If you don't mind, let's define our terms. What is white nationalism?
Yeah, thanks. And that's the right place to start.
Mm-hmm.
So starting in about the 1980s, a number of former Ku Klux Klan members, people who were avowed to the bone white supremacists, decided that what the Ku Klux Klan was not a path to victory for their movement in the future. And, in the post-civil rights movement, they knew that it was so much associated with irrational prejudice. They weren't going to be able to build a sustainable, widespread movement. And so they started to do two things. They started to rebrand the movement. So taking language from the civil rights movement, they started talking about white pride, white nationalism, the civil rights of white people, instead of talking about more traditional, racist ideas associated with the KKK mm-hmm. or neo-Nazi ideas. So they started to rebrand in terms of the language, but then they also started to work on expanding their audience and their membership, and were very early adopters of the internet.
Yeah, I was just going to say, what a way to expand some ideas. Now here we are in the year 2020 with the internet, with social media platforms, which we're going to get to later. And I want to hear from our viewers about this too. In the last couple of weeks, we know big tech social media platforms have started to take down certain accounts, and they're doing a little bit better of a job of policing, which has raised First Amendment questions as well. We'll get into all of that. 737+ is the phone number to call, 737+. I was reading a couple of things here about going all the way back to the Freemasons and conspiracy theories. I mean, there is a history here in the United States of these kind of extremist groups.
Certainly, and there's been an organized racist movement ever since the abolition of slavery.
Right.
It was virtually at the same time that slavery was abolished, the Ku Klux Klan forms as a white terrorist organization, and it reemerges at different points in U.S. history, always in response to the expansion of multiracial democracy. So at every point where there is kind of an expansion of actually following through on the promise of multiracial democracy, there's an organized white supremacist movement. So that's true in the 19-teens and 1920s, when there had been an increase in immigration of Catholics and Eastern European Jews that organized, and at that point there was over 100,000 Ku Klux Klan members across the country. The organized racism emerges again in response to the civil rights movement. That's always been in the background, but it kind of becomes more politically potent often in terms of a backlash. And so I think we can't really understand our current moment without understanding the response to Obama's election and both the changing demographics of the United States, but also how those have been played out politically.
Were you surprised last Wednesday when you saw what happened at the Capitol?
I was completely surprised. I was surprised that they were allowed to breach security.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, they've been organizing online at public forums, for weeks, saying we're going to try to, jump the fence. We're going to try to, invade the Capitol. And in many forums talking about wanting to, actually cause harm to lawmakers. So I wasn't surprised that there was an attempt, but I was surprised at how successful it was.
Yeah, exactly. I want to read something that you wrote back on October 10th. So this is during the height of the election season, before the election itself. And you wrote, let me just read here, political operatives within the Republican Party are now also seizing on this anti-democratic sentiment and turning it into strategy following President Trump's lead. Tactics such as questioning the integrity of the election and attacking the legitimacy of absentee ballots undermine the electoral process and encourage vigilante activity, despite all evidence showing that voter fraud in the U.S. is incredibly rare. Trump's refusal to commit to a peaceful transfer of power could easily act as an accelerant for these threats. And here we are, and it happened.
Yeah, I wish I had been wrong. But I've been studying the online white nationalist movement since 2004. And what I've seen is that, very radical ideas that I once was finding on the very outer edges of the internet, that only people who were avowed white supremacists were engaging in, are now and have become incredibly prominent across much of conservative social media. And one of the most significant components of that is this suspicion of democracy.
Exactly.
It's a criticism of democratic processes, and it's devastating. I mean, in the United States, democratic freedom seems like such an essential core of our national culture, our national values, and I feel like those are being threatened right now.
And I'm just interested in the political impact here, because I have friends of mine who are lifelong Republicans, and they are obviously they hate what they saw. They're more moderate, I guess, and they say that they're never going to be able to kind of get this stain off of them, that there's a large group of Republicans who denounce the violence, who are not on the fringe, who really just want to talk about policy, economic policy, domestic policy, foreign policy, and they can't seem to let those arguments be heard. The policy argument is gone. It's now this kind of fringe argument. Do you agree with that? Or does that even make sense, what I'm saying?
Yeah, I mean, undoubtedly. When we think about even like Republican Party platforms on a national level, it's hard to, it hasn't necessarily coalesced around a particular, set of policies other than being anti-immigration.
Yeah.
But I do think, especially in light of what happened with the siege on the Capitol, that it really raises this question that, I feel like it's incredibly important for people who identify as Republicans, but also support democracy.
Yeah, and a number of them, obviously, as we've seen, 10 House Republicans joining Democrats in voting to impeach, and many of them we saw on the floor of the Senate speaking out and you can tell distancing themselves as best they can. Some of them did not. There are a few who, I know Josh Hawley out of Missouri has been called on the carpet by the editorial boards of a number of newspapers there for his continued support of President Trump and the disinformation surrounding the election and the outcome. But many Republicans in the Senate and House, they know that they need to distance themselves, welcome the new administration, and try to get something done, try to work with the other side. I don't know how easy that's going to be, though.
Right. This is a big thing to try to move on from, for sure.
All right, when we come back, we're going to take a quick break, but you talked about undermining multiracial democracy and how this country is changing. We're always changing. We're always progressing. And also want to delve into psychologically why these groups of extremists, these white nationalists, are so scared. That's coming up, and your phone calls. We want to hear from you. 737 Plus is the number. Call into Open Line. We'll be right back.